What a great honor and a delight to be joining you today during this creation series. Today's topic is neighborhoods, and it is near and dear to my heart. And I know it's something many of you have thought a lot about over the past few years as you looked at how to use your space in new ways. Neighbors, hospitality, justice, even climate change. We're going to wander down all of those roads and through those intersections, but I'm going to start with the theology of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Who here watched Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood as a child yourself or with your own children? You might remember folksy Fred Rogers stepping onto a simple public television set, putting on his cardigan and welcoming you into a world of feelings and friendship and make-believe, singing gently, "It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine?" If you're familiar with Mr. Rogers, maybe you know that he was in fact trained as a Presbyterian minister. He was the most influential theologian of my childhood, and he embedded in a generation of people like me a lesson that is one of the central teachings of our Christian tradition: to love your neighbor. Fred Rogers has been on my mind over the last couple of years as I've shifted from working as a religious leader to being part of governing a city, casting votes that shape who is welcome here, and working to translate religious and community values into on-the-ground decisions. Rabbi and author Dana Ruttenberg describes the entirety of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood as profound theology, which she summarizes as cultivate empathy, be curious, it's okay to have hard feelings, and most of all, love your neighbor as yourself. All of it, Ruttenberg says, a theological stance about who we are and who God is. And I agree. I grew up on unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory. I was baptized and confirmed at Dunbar Heights United. I worked at Moore's Bakery and Bean Brothers as a teen and young adult. I grew up around many of you in a great neighborhood. We knew our neighbors. We cooked and cared for one another, and the many, many neighborhood children played outside on the quiet streets into the evenings. In that neighborhood, I witnessed the compassion and collaboration that people were capable of. We were part of each other's lives in meaningful ways, and I was lucky to know from an early age the joy of neighbors. Now, I've known the work of neighbors too. It wasn't all picket fences and people delivering pies, but our lives were better for having one another nearby. In her book, Grounded, author and theologian Diana Butler Bass says, people create neighborhoods when they gather together beyond family ties, live close to others, and choose to share certain resources: electricity, schools, roads, places of worship, stores, and often a park or some commons. This is how we tend to think of neighborhoods in our day-to-day lives, in terms of proximity and geography. But I'm going to go ahead and suggest that the second commandment, to love your neighbor, isn't just saying, love the person whose property line comes up against your own. So, if it's not just about proximity and property lines, being able to love your neighbor requires considering who our neighbor is. Scripturally, the Good Samaritan story that we heard a few moments ago is the obvious place to look. And it's pretty specific in answering the question. In the book of Luke, the story is told because a lawyer asks Jesus how he can have eternal life. And Jesus says to love God and to love your neighbor. And the lawyer, either being curious or just really wanting to hammer down the specifics, then responds by asking, well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus tells him a story, which might not have been the type of answer the lawyer was looking for. The short version of the story is this. There's a traveler on the road between Jerusalem and Jericho who's stripped of clothing, beaten and left half dead. First a priest and then a Levite come by, but both avoid the man. Finally, a Samaritan comes by, and at the time, it's worth noting, the Samaritans and the Jews despised each other. There was plenty of violence and anger between them, but the Samaritan helps the injured man. Jesus challenges his followers to recognize all people, even those who we despise or fear, even those least prestigious, even those least like us, as our neighbors, regardless of proximity or geography, regardless of wealth or faith or status. It is simple and profound, in part because it's in such stark contrast with the current design of most large cities. In the last century, our neighborhoods have frequently functioned to separate people, historically by race and class, and more recently, functionally by wealth. This is more commonly discussed in US cities, but it's our story in Vancouver too. Vancouver's earliest city planning was heavily influenced by a fellow named Harland Bartholomew. Local housing expert Stephanie Allen has researched and written articulately about Bartholomew and his efforts in particular to see continued racial segregation in cities. Here's some of what I've learned from Stephanie, and I hope you'll bear with me for a moment while I get a tiny bit nerdy. So it used to be that zoning ordinances, the rules that outline what we can build and where, could explicitly say, this is a white neighborhood and Black residents aren't allowed. And in 1916, the US Supreme Court struck those ordinances down. Harland Bartholomew, who was one of the earliest professional city planners in the US, figured out a workaround. He started zoning first residential neighborhood status to existing white majority neighborhoods, allowing only high-end single-family homes, sometimes with light commercial use around the outsides, and then second residential status to Black majority neighborhoods, allowing dense multi-family housing as well as commercial and often heavy or polluting industrial uses. So restrictive zoning was a proxy for other types of exclusion. Well, racial segregation was certainly more explicit in US cities. This same pattern of land use exists here. We have apartments and multifamily housing clumped together closer to industrial lands or lining major arterial streets, and then swaths of quiet, car-dependent neighborhoods of single detached homes. That's the city I grew up in. And as a city councilor who makes current zoning decisions and future zoning decisions, this history is always in my mind. We're called to think of all people as our neighbors, but often, because of some mix of intentional and unintentional policy decisions, we live surrounded by folks who are relatively similar to us. And of course, our whole city here has been built on the unceded land of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and yet they too were segregated to specific plots of reserve designated land. And also, our history of protecting low density neighborhoods from mixed housing has led to a reliance on private vehicles and massive urban sprawl, which is part of why I care about housing policy so much, not just as a justice issue, but also as a climate issue. Our infatuation with this dream of a large house with a large private yard and an abundance of space to fill with belongings has led to long commutes and loss of vital farmland, unending consumerism, and huge environmental footprints. Which is why, when I'm faced with zoning questions, I'm thinking about what the climate emergency means with respect to complete communities and welcoming all income levels. It's why I sometimes think that we need to be a little bit more Sesame Street and a little bit less Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Diana Butler Bass writes, "The neighborhood is an empty concept without neighbors," which rings true to me. I like having neighbors, and I want, like most of us, I think, to be a good neighbor, especially to those quite unlike me. Our sense of the world is shaped by what we see of it, and I want my kids to grow up around people who are different from them. I want them to embrace, not fear, difference. In one of her most recent books, Braving the Wilderness, author and researcher Brene Brown writes, "People are hard to hate close up. Move in. People are hard to hate close up. Move in." Fred Rogers provided a good example of that. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood began airing in 1968, following an intense decade of political assassinations, the civil rights movement, and the Vietnam War. Mr. Rogers showed a world of kindness where neighbors love and support each other through all sorts of challenges, but he didn't coddle his audience. He helped them, young and old, face their own fears and prejudices. And of all of his 865 episodes, one in particular still stands out. One of the frequent visiting characters in the neighborhood was Francois Clemens, a talented opera singer and the descendant of slaves, who played a police officer on the show. In 1989, a year after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, at a time when Black Americans were still prevented from swimming alongside whites in pools across the country, the neighborhood featured an episode where Mr. Rogers, who was white, invited Officer Clemens, who was Black, to join him in soaking his bare feet in a backyard baby pool on a hot summer's day. And as they sat there together, the camera paused with intention on Rogers' very white feet, soaking right next to Clemens' very Black feet. Many Americans at the time rarely interacted with those of another race. Most neighborhoods were still functionally segregated, and Mr. Rogers demonstrated how his viewers' lives could be richer if they saw each other up close as neighbors. And theologian that he was, he did so with imagery that connected his audience to the Christian ritual of foot washing, of serving one another as an act of connection and of faith. Mr. Rogers, the minister, was doing his bit in guiding a country fearful about desegregation. We too are living in fearful times. We face our own enormous set of challenges, emboldened hatred and growing division, a widening wealth gap, and a planet on fire. The stakes are high, and everywhere we see people reverting to their own safe corner. Catholic priest and author Henry Nouwen once noted, "Our society seems to be increasingly full of fearful, defensive, aggressive people, anxiously clinging to their property and inclined to look at the surrounding world with suspicion, always expecting an enemy to suddenly appear or do harm." As he said, our task is to convert hostility into hospitality, turn the enemy into a guest. Along those same lines, Butler Bass quotes poet Robert Frost's famous line that good fences make good neighbors, but offers her own interpretation that perhaps good fences have gates. Our neighborhoods were designed to keep us apart, but now as much as ever, we desperately need to see one another up close, to bear witness to the difficulty others face, and to be broken open to one another's humanity. We are capable of it, and in fact, we're hardwired for it. Author Rebecca Solnit has detailed how consistently expressions of human caring and solidarity arise during crisis. She writes, "In the wake of an earthquake, a bombing, or a major storm, most people are altruistic, urgently engaged in caring for themselves and those around them, strangers and neighbors, as well as friends and loved ones. The image of the selfish, panicky human being in times of disaster has little truth to it." She continues that decades of meticulous sociological research in behavior in disasters, from the bombings of World War II to floods, tornadoes, earthquakes, and storms across the continent and around the world, have demonstrated this. Horrible in itself, disaster is sometimes the back door into paradise, the paradise at least, in which we are who we hope to be, do the work we desire, and are our brothers and sisters' keepers. So what does that mean for us in this moment? Most of us are, for now, slightly shielded from the most devastating effects of the housing crisis and the climate emergency, but we're informed enough to know that for a great many of our neighbors in this city and around the globe, largely poor and racialized folks, the toll is already being felt. And we should recognize that it's only going to intensify. According to the UN, between 200 million and 1 billion migrants are on the move because of climate change, will be on the move because of climate change by 2050 around the globe and in our neighboring municipalities. Where will these people live? Will they be welcome among us on our block? In his famous Riverside sermon, A Time to Break Silence, Martin Luther King preached that on the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will only be an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho Road must be transformed. How will we respond to emboldened racism and xenophobia, to the instability of housing more and more people face, to climate change and climate migrants? Are we ready to dismantle the barriers that divide us, to see one another up close? This will be the test of who we are in the coming years and decades. Will we love our neighbors, particularly those unlike us? Will we welcome them and make space for them, not just abstractly, but in tangible ways? At the end of the telling of the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus answers the question of who is my neighbor by saying, he who showed mercy, love, kindness, and justice. And then Jesus says, go and do likewise. Amen.